Prepare to delve into a tale that defies reason and reveals the darkest side of human nature. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from now. This is the story of Silas Boone, a man whose name was deliberately erased from official records, but whose actions echoed through the Appalachian Mountains for decades. A hunter who crossed every imaginable line and became something far worse than any wild animal that ever roamed those forests. It's the autumn of 1847. The Appalachian Mountains stretch like an endless spine along the east coast of the United States, cutting through states like Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky. At that time, these regions were only partially explored. Isolated communities lived in deep valleys, separated from each other by days' walk along perilous trails. The law was a distant idea, something that existed in coastal towns, but rarely reached those misty corners where civilization seemed to have stood still in time. Silas Boone was 33 years old when the first reports about him began to circulate. Born somewhere near the Smoky Mountains on the Tennessee-North Carolina border, he grew up knowing every ravine, every cave, every hidden trail in that vast, green, frightening wilderness. His surname carried weight in that region. Some said he was a distant relative of Daniel Boone, the legendary explorer who blazed the trail to Kentucky decades earlier. But while Daniel was celebrated as a hero, Silas would become quite the opposite. Records from the time describe Silas as a tall man with broad shoulders and enormous hands marked by knife scars and bear claws. He lived alone in a log cabin deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. No one knew for sure where his address was. Some said it was near the Shenandoah River. Others swore it was farther south near the North Carolina border. The fact is, Silas only appeared in small villages when he needed to trade furs and game meat for gunpowder, salt, and whiskey. He was known as the best tracker in the region. Local hunters said Silas could follow a deer's trail for 3 days through rain and snow. He knew the animal's habits better than any man alive. But there was something disturbing in his eyes, a cold emptiness that made even the bravest men look away. Village women begged their husbands not to do business with him. Children were forbidden to come near him when he came down from the mountains. For years, Silas maintained a predictable routine. He hunted, sold his furs, bought supplies, and disappeared back up the mountain. But in the winter of 1846 to 1847, something changed. Travelers began disappearing along the trails that crisscrossed the Blue Ridge. First, a traveling salesman heading from Roanoke to Abingdon, Virginia. Then a ranching couple trying to cross the mountains into Kentucky. Then 3 prospectors searching for gold in the streams of the Smoky Mountains. Back then, disappearances were not uncommon. The mountains were treacherous. People got lost, fell off cliffs, were attacked by bears, or simply succumbed to the bitter cold of Appalachian winters. But the frequency of disappearances began to attract attention. Between December 1846 and March 1847, at least 12 people vanished across a roughly 50-mile stretch of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The sheriffs of Augusta, Rockbridge, and Boat-Tourt counties, all in Virginia, began exchanging letters. The letters took weeks to circulate between the isolated villages, but gradually a pattern emerged. All the missing people had something in common. They had been last seen on specific trails, routes that cut through the most remote regions of the mountains. And there was another disturbing detail. Witnesses reported seeing a tall man with a thick beard and leather clothing, watching the travelers from afar before they vanished. In the spring of 1847, the Rockbridge County Sheriff, a man named Thomas Whitfield, decided to investigate personally. Whitfield was known for his tenacity. He had served in the Virginia militia during conflicts with Native American tribes and was not easily intimidated. He gathered 4 trusted men and set off up the mountain, following the trails where the disappearances had occurred. For 5 days, they traveled through ravines and valleys, questioning the few residents who lived in these heights. Most refused to speak. There was fear in the air, a heavy silence that seemed to envelop the entire region. But finally, in a secluded cabin near the Maury River, an elderly woman agreed to talk. She said she had known Silas Boone since he was a boy and that something terrible had happened to him. According to the woman, Silas had changed completely after a particularly harsh winter years before. He had been trapped in the snow for weeks, without food, nearly starving. When he finally emerged from the mountains, he had something in his eyes that she described as soullessness. From that moment on, Silas began to withdraw further and further from people, plunging into the depths of the forests as if searching for something no one else could understand. Sheriff Whitfield took careful notes. He knew he needed to find Silas, but locating a man who knew every inch of those mountains would be nearly impossible. That night, camped in a clearing, the sheriff's men heard a sound that froze them. It was a long, high-pitched whistle coming from the surrounding trees. It wasn't an animal sound, it was human, and it was too close. The men stood motionless around the fire, their hands close to their weapons. The whistling sound repeated, this time coming from a different direction, as if someone were circling the camp. Sheriff Whitfield ordered absolute silence. For long minutes nothing happened but the crackling of the flames and the cold wind blowing down from the mountains. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the whistling stopped. As the sun rose, they found footprints all around the camp, worn boot prints deep in the mud, forming a near-perfect circle around where they had slept. Whitfield realized in that moment that they were being watched. Whoever it was knew their every move before they even made it. The mountains were his territory, and they were merely clumsy intruders treading unfamiliar ground. The decision was unanimous. Return to the village, gather more men, and return with a larger group. But something would happen before they could execute this plan. 2 days after Whitfield's return, a farmer named Elijah Garrett showed up at the sheriff's office with a discovery that would completely change the investigation. Garrett lived on a secluded property on the southern edge of Rockbridge County, near the banks of the James River. He was checking his hunting traps when he found something that deeply disturbed him. Personal belongings scattered across a narrow ravine, approximately 2 miles from his farm. There was a damp, damaged leather suitcase, torn clothes, a Bible with loose pages, and a still-working pocket watch. Garrett recognized some of the items. They belonged to the traveling salesman who had disappeared months before. But what frightened him most was the sheer number of disparate objects scattered around the area. They weren't just one person's belongings. There were shoes of various sizes, fragments of letters, coins, rusty knives, and even a woman's dress hanging from a branch, swaying in the wind like a silent ghost. Whitfield immediately gathered a group of 15 men and followed Garrett to the site. What they found there defied rational explanation. The ravine was deep and narrow, hidden by dense vegetation. It was the kind of place someone would only find if they were very familiar with the area or actively searching for a hiding place. The objects were scattered chaotically, as if they had been dumped there over months, perhaps years. Even more disturbing was what they found nearby. There was clear evidence that someone frequented the place regularly. Ashes from ancient fires, animal bones piled strangely, and marks on the trees that seemed to form some kind of code or counting system. One of the trees had deep notches, dozens of them, arranged in parallel lines. Whitfield counted 73 marks in all. One of the men in the group, an experienced hunter named Jacob Morrison, examined the bones more closely. He noticed something that made his stomach churn. Some of the bones had been broken in a specific way, a technique known among hunters to extract the marrow, but these bones weren't all from wild animals. Morrison said nothing at the time, but later confided his darkest suspicions to the sheriff. There was something deeply wrong with this place. The news spread quickly through the surrounding communities. The fear that had previously been merely a vague feeling now had shape and location. People began to avoid that region of the mountains altogether. Travelers began taking long detours, adding days to their journeys just to avoid crossing the trails near the ravine. But Sheriff Whitfield knew that running away wouldn't solve anything. Whoever was responsible had to be found and brought to justice. Over the next few weeks, Whitfield organized systematic searches. Groups of armed men scoured the mountains, searching for signs of Silas Boone or anyone else who might be involved. They questioned all the residents of the isolated cabins, offered rewards for information, and even hired Native American trackers who knew the territory well. But Silas seemed to have melted into the shadows of the mountains. Then came the discovery that would make everything even more sinister. In mid-April of 1847, a shepherd leading his sheep to higher pastures came across an abandoned cabin on the remote slopes of the Blue Ridge. The structure was primitive, made of loosely fitted logs and covered with branches and leaves. It was so well camouflaged that it would have been impossible to see from more than 10 meters away. When the sheriff's men arrived, what they found inside left them speechless. The cabin was small, no bigger than a large closet, but the interior revealed a disturbed mind. The walls were covered with marks and scratches, forming incomprehensible patterns. There were chains attached to the wooden beams, ropes frayed from use, and dark stains on the packed dirt floor that no one cared to examine too closely. But most disturbing was a collection of personal objects arranged with almost reverent care on makeshift shelves, pocket watches lined up by size, wedding rings arranged in a small wooden box, faded photographs tacked to the wall, letters folded and tied with string. Each item represented a life, a story, a person who had passed through those mountains and never been seen again. Whitfield ordered everything to be catalogued and carefully removed. It took 3 trips to transport all the objects found in the cabin. When they finally finished, they had recorded belongings that could be linked to at least 28 different people, 28 lives that simply disappeared into the dark folds of the Appalachians. The question was now clear and terrible. Where was Silas Boone? And more importantly, would he act again? The answers would come in a way no one expected, through an encounter that would test the limits of human courage and reveal the true extent of the darkness that had taken hold of this man. The spring of 1847 brought unusual warmth to the Appalachian Mountains. Rapid snowmelt swollen rivers and turned trails into treacherous quagmires. It was during this period that a man arrived in Rockbridge County who would change the course of the investigation. His name was Samuel Pritchard, a tracker from Kentucky with a formidable reputation. Pritchard had spent years working with fur traders on the western frontier and knew the survival tactics of the mountain men better than anyone else. Whitfield hired him immediately, offering a generous sum of $100 for Silas Boone's capture. Pritchard scouted every location where evidence had been found, studied movement patterns, and spent days talking to locals. His conclusion was disturbing and accurate. Silas wasn't running away. He was hunting, and like any good hunter, he had a defined territory, predictable routes, and specific methods. Pritchard explained to the sheriff that men like Silas develop almost ritualized behaviors. They don't act on impulse, but rather on an internal logic that makes sense only to themselves. The locations of the disappearances weren't random. They were all near water sources, at points where the trails naturally narrowed, forcing travelers to slow down. These were perfect ambush spots, where someone familiar with the terrain would have a clear advantage over any outsider. Based on this analysis, Pritchard drew a detailed map of the likely locations where Silas might be moving. There were 3 main areas: the headwaters of the Maury River, a cave region near Humpback Mountain, and a deep valley known locally as Devil's Throat, where the sun rarely reached the forest floor. Pritchard suggested a bold strategy. Instead of chasing Silas, they would lure him out of hiding. The plan was risky but simple. They would spread the word that a caravan of traders would pass through the region on a specific date, carrying valuable goods. The information would be strategically planted in the taverns and trading posts where Silas was known to appear. If he was still in the area and maintained some contact with the outside world, he would eventually hear about the caravan. And if Pritchard was right about his behavior patterns, Silas would be unable to resist. For 2 weeks the news circulated. There was talk of a caravan of 6 wagons coming from Richmond, carrying fine fabrics, tools, weapons, and even some jewelry. The planned route would pass precisely along the trails where the disappearances had occurred. Of course, it was all a hoax. There was no real caravan. Just 15 armed men disguised as traders, with Pritchard leading the operation and Sheriff Whitfield supervising from afar. On May 17, 1847, the group set out from Lexington, following the trail that ran alongside the Maury River toward the higher mountains. They kept a deliberately slow pace, making noise, talking loudly, acting exactly as carefree traders would. At night, they camped in open clearings, maintaining large fires and appearing careless about security. But in the shadows around them, additional men watched silently, rifles loaded and ready. The first 3 days passed without incident. Pritchard began to doubt his own strategy. Perhaps Silas had abandoned the region altogether. Perhaps he was dead, a victim of the very mountains he mastered so well. Or perhaps he was smarter than anyone imagined and had seen through the trap. But on the 4th night, something changed. They had camped in a narrow valley near a stream that cascaded from the rocks above. The sound of rushing water created a constant curtain of sound, making it difficult to hear any other sounds. Around midnight, one of the lookouts noticed movement on the opposite bank of the stream. It was merely a shadow, something that could easily have been mistaken for a deer or other nocturnal animal, but Pritchard, who remained awake and alert, recognized the shape. It was human. He gave a discreet signal to the other men, who were already strategically positioned around the camp. No one moved. The shadow remained still for long minutes, simply watching. Then it began to move slowly along the creek bank, always keeping to the darkest areas, where the firelight couldn't reach. Pritchard realized he was witnessing something rare. A predator sizing up its prey, calculating risks, looking for weaknesses. The figure stopped again, this time closer. In the dim starlight, Pritchard could make out some details. It was a large man, dressed in dark, tanned leather. He carried something in his hands, probably a weapon. His movement was cautious but confident, the gait of someone who knew every rock and twig in the terrain. Silas Boone had fallen for the bait. But then something unexpected happened. The figure stopped abruptly and turned its head in the exact direction where one of Pritchard's men was hiding, more than 30 meters away. There was no way he could have seen or heard the man in that darkness. It was as if he possessed an additional sense, a supernatural awareness of his surroundings. For an endless moment, everything hung in a heavy silence. Then Silas did something that left everyone stunned. He began to laugh. It wasn't loud or hysterical, but low and drawn out, a sound that held something deeply disturbing. It was the laugh of someone who had just understood a macabre joke, of someone who saw humor where there should be none. The sound echoed through the valley, mingling with the rushing water, creating an unsettling melody that sent a shiver down even the bravest men's spine. Pritchard made the decision in a split second. He shouted the order to attack. 15 men emerged simultaneously from their positions, surrounding the area where Silas stood. Torches were lit, illuminating the valley with a dancing orange light. But when the light finally revealed the creek bank, there was no one there. Silas had vanished like smoke, leaving only footprints in the mud that ended abruptly near the rocks. Frustration gripped the group. They had been so close, and yet Silas had slipped away like a spectre. Pritchard ordered an immediate search of the camp, but he knew it would be futile. In that darkness, pursuing someone who knew every inch of those mountains would be suicide. They would have to wait for dawn. No one slept that night. The men lay awake, weapons drawn, watching the shadows dancing beyond the reach of the firelight. When the sun finally rose, painting the sky pink and gold, Pritchard led a meticulous perimeter survey. The footprints they had seen the night before continued beyond the rocks, following the stream up the mountain. They were deep marks, indicating a heavy man moving quickly. But most intriguing was that at one point, the footprints simply changed direction impossibly, as if Silas had leaped more than 10 feet from one rock to another, without leaving any traces in between. Morrison, the experienced hunter who had already examined the bones in the ravine, pointed out something everyone had overlooked. Near the spot where the footprints disappeared, there were fresh marks on a tree. They were deep scratches in the bark, made by something sharp, forming a repeating sequence. 3 vertical lines, a pause, then 2 horizontal lines. Morrison suggested it might be a message, a warning deliberately left for them to find. Whitfield, who had joined the group just at dawn, stood thoughtfully before the marks. He remembered the carvings found in the abandoned cabin, the 73 markings they had counted. A disturbing theory began to form in his mind. Silas wasn't simply killing out of necessity or impulse. There was a method, a system, something that gave meaning to his actions within his own twisted logic. The marks were tallies, records of something only he understood. The chase continued up the mountain. The group followed the tracks for more than 5 miles, through increasingly rugged terrain. They crossed icy streams, climbed rocky slopes, and traversed forests so dense that the sun barely penetrated the treetops. With each passing hour, it became clearer that they were being led somewhere specific. The tracks were so easy to follow, almost as if Silas wanted them to find him. Around noon, they reached an area none of them knew. It was a high plateau, surrounded by cliffs on 3 sides, with only a narrow entrance where they had just passed. The vegetation here was different, lower and twisted, as if the constant wind had molded the trees into grotesque shapes. In the center of the plateau were the remains of an ancient fire, and around it, arranged in a near-perfect circle, were large stones with more carved markings. Pritchard ordered everyone to halt and assess the situation. This was clearly a trap. They were on high exposed ground without adequate cover, and the only exit was the narrow path they had entered. If anyone wanted to ambush them, this would be the perfect place. But retreating now would mean losing the only real clue they had gleaned from months of investigation. The decision was to press forward, but with extreme caution. The men spread out across the plateau, examining every stone, every mark, looking for signs of where Silas might have gone. It was then that one of them, a young man named Henry Clark, shouted that he had found something. On the opposite side of the plateau, partially hidden by the low vegetation, was an opening in the rocks. It was the entrance to a cave, wide enough for a man to pass through hunched over, descending at a steep angle into the depths of the mountain. The darkness emanating from that opening seemed almost solid, as if it were a living substance repelling the daylight. A strange smell came from within, a mixture of mold, damp earth, and something else, something organic and unpleasant that instinctively made the men recoil. Pritchard lit a torch and approached the entrance, illuminating the first few meters of the tunnel. The walls were natural rock, polished by centuries of water, and the floor sloped steadily downward into total darkness. Whitfield made a decision that would be debated for years in Virginia taverns. He ordered only 5 men to enter the cave, including himself and Pritchard. The other 10 would remain above ground, guarding the entrance and ensuring no one escaped. It was a calculated risk, but a necessary one. If Silas was truly inside, they needed mobility and speed, not numbers. The 5 men descended into the darkness, torches raised, rifles ready. The tunnel was narrow and claustrophobic, forcing them to move single file. The air grew colder and more humid with every meter they descended. Occasionally the tunnel opened into small chambers, but soon it narrowed again, always descending, always taking them deeper into the heart of the mountain. The sound of dripping water echoed off the walls, creating a cacophony of whispers and echoes that hampered any attempt to hear footsteps or movement ahead. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, the tunnel finally opened into a larger cavern. The torches revealed a space the size of a small church, with a high ceiling lost in shadow and stalactites hanging like the teeth of some stone monster. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't the impressive geological formation. It was what was carefully arranged in the center of the cavern. There was an area arranged as if it were a dwelling. Animal skins lay spread out on the rocky floor, a pile of dry firewood, rudimentary kitchen utensils made of rusted metal. Hands surrounding all this, arranged on the walls like a macabre gallery, were personal objects, hundreds of them, shoes of all sizes and styles, hats hanging from ledges in the rock, bags and suitcases stacked in corners, and photographs, dozens of photographs nailed directly to the damp stone, faces of people staring into the emptiness of the cave. Pritchard slowly approached one of the walls, raising his torch to better examine the photographs. He recognized some faces. They were people who had been reported missing over the past few years. Businessmen, farmers, a young woman in a formal dress, a pastor holding a Bible. Each image was a fragment of a life interrupted, a moment frozen in time before these people met their fate in those unforgiving mountains. It was Morrison who noticed something that made his blood run cold. The photographs were arranged in groups, separated by rows of small stones, and in each group there was a specific number of images. 3 here, 5 there, 7 in the next group. He began counting in his head, looking for a pattern. Then he understood. The numbers were sequential, but with skipped values. 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 17, 19. They were all prime numbers. Before he could share his discovery, a sound echoed through the cave chambers. It was a human voice, deep and hoarse, singing something that sounded like an ancient song, perhaps a religious hymn distorted beyond recognition. The melody came from somewhere deeper in the cave, from tunnels branching off beyond the main chamber. The voice rose and fell, sometimes clear, sometimes just a drawn-out murmur that mingled with the sound of dripping water. Whitfield signaled for everyone to remain completely silent. They listened. The song continued, repeating the same lines over and over, the words barely comprehensible but charged with a strange emotion, somewhere between sadness and joy. Then, abruptly, the voice stopped. The silence that followed was even more disturbing than the song itself. It was an expectant silence, as if something were about to happen, as if the mountain itself were holding its breath. The 5 men remained paralyzed in that subterranean chamber, each holding their breath, listening for any movement in the depths of the cavern. The torchlight created dancing shadows on the walls, making the photographs seem to come to life, as if those frozen-in-time faces were watching the intruders with silent disapproval. Pritchard slowly raised his hand, pointing to one of the side tunnels from where the voice had come. It was a narrow passage, lower than the others, forcing anyone to crawl through it. Whitfield shook his head. Entering that tunnel would be madness. They would be completely vulnerable, unable to use their weapons properly, at the mercy of whoever was on the other side. But before they could decide their next move, the voice returned. This time, it wasn't a song. It was clear words, in English, echoing through the chambers with disturbing clarity. "You've come for me," the voice said. It wasn't a question, but a quiet, almost amused statement. "How many are there? 5? 6? It doesn't matter. These mountains know each of you now. They know the scent of your fear. They know the weight of your sins." There was a long pause, then a sound that might have been a laugh or perhaps a sob. "I knew fear too, before. Now I know only hunger." Morrison whispered to Whitfield that they needed to get out of there immediately. The situation was completely out of control. They didn't know how many exits there were, they didn't know the terrain, and they were dealing with someone who had clearly lost all semblance of sanity. But Pritchard had another idea. He answered the voice, keeping his tone firm and authoritative. "Silas Boone, my name is Samuel Pritchard. I'm here with Sheriff Whitfield of Rockbridge County. We need to talk to you about the disappearances in the mountains. If you leave peacefully, I guarantee you'll be treated fairly." The words sounded hollow even to Pritchard as he spoke them. Justice seemed to have no place in this cold, damp cave, surrounded by evidence of crimes beyond civilized comprehension. The silence stretched so long that the men began to think Silas wouldn't answer. Then the voice returned, but this time from a completely different direction, from another tunnel on the opposite side of the chamber. "Justice? What an interesting word to use down here, where the earth swallows everything, where there is no law beyond survival, where the strong take from the weak and no one is there to see, to judge, to condemn." The voice grew quieter, almost a whisper. "You want to take me to your prisons, hang me in your public squares, but I've been dead for a long time. The man you seek died that winter, when the snow covered everything and hunger devoured his soul." Pritchard signaled for the other men to begin backing slowly toward the tunnel they had entered. Something in Silas's voice had changed, becoming more agitated, more unsteady. It was like hearing someone talking to themselves, shifting between different personalities. The tracker had seen men driven mad before, survivors of brutal winters who returned from the mountains with broken minds. But this was different. Silas wasn't simply mad. There was a dark consciousness guiding his actions, a twisted intelligence that still functioned, just operating under completely different rules. When they were just a few meters from the main chamber's exit, it happened. A figure emerged from one of the side tunnels with surprising speed. It was Silas Boone, but he looked nothing like the descriptions they had gathered. He was gaunt to the point of cadaverous appearance, his skin stretched taut over his facial bones. His hair and beard were long and matted, full of debris and dried mud. He was wearing layers of disparate clothing, obviously taken from his victims, creating a grotesque and disjointed appearance. But it was his eyes that were most disturbing. They were empty and savage at the same time, like those of an animal that had completely forgotten what it meant to be human. Silas held a long knife in his right hand, its blade reflecting the torchlight with an ominous glint. He didn't attack immediately. Instead, he stopped a few feet away, studying the men like a predator weighing its options. His chest rose and fell rapidly, and a low, steady sound came from his throat, something between a growl and a whimper. Clark, the young member of the group, instinctively raised his rifle, but Pritchard stopped him with a brusque gesture. A shot in that confined space would deafen them all and could cause a cave-in. "Silas," Whitfield said, trying to keep his voice calm, "it doesn't have to end like this. I know you've been through hardships, I know mountains can break a man, but there's still a way back. There's still a chance to—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Silas started laughing again, that low, haunting laugh they'd heard the night before. It was a sound that carried years of loneliness, hunger, and something much darker that had taken root in his mind. "Way back?" Silas repeated, his voice hoarse and drawling. "There is no way back. There is only the way down, ever deeper, where the roots of the mountains drink blood and the bones turn to stone." He took a step forward, and all the men instinctively recoiled. "Do you want to know what happened to the travelers? Do you want to hear about each of them? I can tell you, I remember every face, every voice, every plea. They live here now, in these walls, in these stones. The mountain holds them forever." Morrison decided it was time to act. He was closest to Silas, and he had a rope tied to his belt. If he could lasso the man, perhaps they could subdue him together. But as he made the move, Silas reacted with a speed impossible for someone in his apparently weakened state. He dove to the side, disappearing into another tunnel before anyone could react. The sound of his footsteps echoed for a few seconds, then silence. Pritchard wasted no time. He ordered an immediate retreat. They began running through the tunnel back to the surface, their torches flickering with their movement, creating a chaotic illumination that made every step a risk. Behind them, coming from the depths of the cave, Silas's voice echoed one last time. "These mountains are mine, always have been, and you have just entered my church, my temple, my eternal home. Come back whenever you want to be devoured by the darkness." When they finally emerged into the daylight, panting and covered in cold sweat, the men who had remained guarding the entrance reported something disturbing. During the time the group had been inside the cave, they had heard sounds coming from other openings around the plateau. They were sounds of movement, of stones being dragged, and occasionally that same low laughter. There were other entrances and exits to this network of caves. Silas knew each one. This mountain was his labyrinth, and they had been foolish to think they could capture him in his own territory. The group returned to Lexington the next day, physically and mentally exhausted. The cave encounter had left its mark beyond mere fatigue. Clark, the young man who had found the cave entrance, couldn't stop shaking, even in the heat of the afternoon sun. Morrison spoke little, lost in dark thoughts. Even Pritchard, the seasoned tracker who had faced dangerous men across the frontier, admitted to Sheriff Whitfield that he had never witnessed anything so disturbing in his entire career. Whitfield called an emergency meeting at Lexington City Hall 3 days after his return. Sheriffs from 5 neighboring counties attended: Rockbridge, Augusta, Botetourt, Allegheny, and Bath. Also present were local judges, the district attorney, and several prominent citizens. The room was packed, with people crowded at doors and windows, trying to hear what would be discussed. Fear had spread like wildfire through the communities. Entire families were abandoning their isolated farms, moving to larger towns where they felt safer. Whitfield presented everything they had discovered so far. He spoke of the objects found in the ravine, the abandoned cabin filled with personal belongings, and finally the terrifying encounter in the caves of the Blue Ridge Mountains. When he mentioned the photographs arranged in prime numbers, and Silas's disturbing words about the mountain keeping its victims forever, a heavy silence fell over the room. It wasn't just horror. It was the gradual realization that they were dealing with something beyond a common criminal. Judge Cornelius Hampton, a man in his 60s who had served on the Virginia bench for 3 decades, rose to speak. His voice was deep and carried authority. "Gentlemen, what we face here is not just a man who has strayed from the path of the law. We are facing someone who poses an existential threat to every community in these mountains. Commercial roads are being abandoned. Families live in constant fear. The very idea of traveling through the Appalachians has become synonymous with mortal danger." Hampton proposed something unprecedented for the region. He suggested forming a formal militia, authorized by the Virginia state government, with the specific purpose of hunting Silas Boone. It would not be simply a group of armed volunteers, but an organized operation with state funds, adequate equipment, and coordination across multiple counties. The proposal generated heated debate. Some argued that it was an excessive use of public resources to pursue a single man. Others questioned whether they had the legal authority to do so. But District Attorney Joshua Brennan presented a compelling argument. He had spent the past few days reviewing missing person records, not only in Virginia counties, but also in adjacent parts of Tennessee and North Carolina. His findings were alarming. In the past 5 years, from the brutal winter of 1841 to 1842, more than 40 people had disappeared in the mountainous regions along a specific corridor stretching approximately 100 miles through the Blue Ridge and Smoky Mountains. Brennan showed a map where he had marked each disappearance with a red pin. The pattern was undeniable. There was a clear concentration of cases in certain areas, all connected by old trails that cut through the mountains. And when he overlaid this map with another showing the locations where Silas Boone had been seen over the years, the correlations were impossible to ignore. Wherever Silas established a presence for a few months, disappearances increased dramatically. The vote was unanimous. The militia would be formed. Hampton took it upon himself to seek formal approval from Virginia Governor William Smith, who at the time was facing his own political pressures related to territorial expansion and conflicts with native populations. But even with all the state's problems, the situation in the mountains had become too critical to ignore. Merchants refused to make deliveries. Postal services altered routes, adding weeks to deadlines. The local economy was being strangled by fear. While awaiting official approval, Pritchard proposed a different strategy. He argued that attacking the caves again would be futile. Silas knew that tunnel system better than anyone. He could hide there for months, emerging only to hunt when necessary. Instead, Pritchard suggested they study Silas's behavior as they would any wild animal. They needed to understand his patterns, his basic needs, his vulnerabilities. Morrison supported the idea and added his own observations. Based on what they had seen in the cave, it was clear that Silas still relied on certain supplies he couldn't produce himself. Gunpowder for his weapons, salt, possibly whiskey, based on old merchant accounts. This meant he still needed some contact with the outside world, however minimal and carefully controlled. If they could identify where and how he obtained these supplies, they could establish surveillance and eventually intercept him. Over the next few weeks, a silent operation was implemented. Men were discreetly stationed at every trading post and tavern within a 50-mile radius of the areas where Silas had been seen. They wore no uniforms and made no announcements. They were simply ordinary travelers, farmers, or merchants, but all were trained to recognize Silas based on the detailed descriptions that had been circulated. The order was clear. Do not attempt to capture him alone. Simply follow and report his location. In mid-June of 1847, the strategy yielded its first results. One of the watchmen, a man named Thomas Reeves, stationed at a secluded tavern near the James River, reported a suspicious encounter. An individual matching Silas's description had appeared at dusk, lingering in the shadows outside the establishment. He didn't enter but signaled to the owner, an elderly man named Ezekiel Hunt. Hunt went outside and spoke briefly with the stranger, then returned inside and prepared a bundle containing several items: gunpowder, matches, salt, a bottle of whiskey, and some dried meat. He took the bundle outside and handed it to the man in the shadows, who placed a few silver coins in Hunt's hand and quickly disappeared into the darkness. The entire exchange lasted less than 5 minutes. Reeves didn't attempt to follow the man immediately, but carefully marked the direction in which he had departed. When Whitfield confronted Hunt the next morning, the old tavern keeper initially denied everything, but under pressure and threats of being accused as an accomplice, he finally confessed. Silas had been making these irregular visits for over 2 years, always at night, always remaining in the shadows, always paying in ancient coins that seemed to come from different eras. Hunt swore he knew nothing of Silas's crimes. He simply thought he was dealing with an eccentric hermit who preferred to avoid social contact. The excuse sounded weak even to Hunt himself as he uttered it, but the most valuable information came when Hunt revealed that Silas followed a temporal pattern. He appeared approximately every 3 weeks, usually on moonless nights when the darkness was most complete. His last visit had been just 4 days ago. This meant that if the pattern continued, Silas would return in about 17 days. Finally, they had a predictable window of opportunity. Pritchard and Whitfield devised a meticulous plan. They wouldn't attempt to capture Silas during the exchange at the tavern. That could easily go wrong and result in deaths. Instead, they would allow the transaction to proceed as normal, but would have specialized trackers strategically positioned to follow Silas after he left. 5 teams of 2 men each would be arranged in a semicircle around the tavern, ready to follow any direction he took. The following days were spent in intense preparation. Pritchard recruited more experienced trackers, some from Kentucky and Tennessee. These were men who had spent years in the mountains, familiar with techniques for silent movement and survival in hostile terrain. Each team was equipped with 5 days' worth of supplies, rifles, pistols, ropes, and emergency flares in case they encountered Silas and needed backup quickly. The estimated date for Silas's next visit arrived. It was a moonless July night, the heat of the day giving way to a cool breeze descending from the mountains. The teams had been in position since dusk, hidden at strategic points around Hunt's tavern. Whitfield remained inside, disguised as a common traveler drinking whiskey. Pritchard was hidden in the bushes about 50 yards from the entrance, with a clear view of all entrances. The hours dragged by. Midnight passed, then 1 in the morning. Pritchard began to doubt. Perhaps Silas had changed his pattern. Perhaps he had found another supplier, or perhaps he knew it was a trap and was somewhere in the shadows, watching the watchers, silently laughing at the futility of their efforts. Then, shortly after 2 in the morning, Pritchard noticed something. It wasn't a sound or visible movement. It was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, as if the air had grown denser. The nocturnal insects that had maintained their constant symphony suddenly fell silent. It was a sign every experienced hunter recognizes, the presence of a predator nearby. Pritchard gave a discreet hand signal, alerting the other teams. Everyone froze in their positions, breathing slowly, eyes scanning the darkness. The figure emerged from the forest with an almost preternatural stealth. Even knowing where to look, Pritchard could barely distinguish Silas from the surrounding shadows. He moved strangely, pausing every few steps, turning his head slowly from side to side, like an animal testing the wind for danger. His clothes were covered in mud and leaves, a natural camouflage that made him nearly invisible. He reached the edge of the clearing where the tavern stood and stopped completely, simply watching. Minutes passed without any movement. Silas remained as still as a statue, and Pritchard began to fear he had detected something suspicious and would leave. But then, apparently satisfied, Silas strode quickly across the clearing and knocked 3 times on the tavern's side door, a specific pattern Hunt would recognize. The old tavern keeper emerged, carrying the usual bundle. The exchange was quick and efficient, coins exchanged for supplies. Not a word spoken, and then Silas retreated into the shadows. Pritchard waited until Silas was at least 100 meters from the tavern before signaling. 2 of the teams began moving silently, following the trail Silas left. Pritchard observed through the darkness, using techniques he had learned from native trackers years before. Don't look directly where you want to see, but use your peripheral vision. Focus not on details but on movement patterns, and above all be patient. Silas headed north, gradually climbing toward higher elevations. He didn't use any known trails, preferring to move through dense forest, crossing streams at unexpected points, sometimes doubling back on his own steps. It was clear he was checking to see if he was being followed, but Pritchard's trackers were good. They kept their distance, alternating who was closest, never staying in one position for long. As the night wore on and the first grey light of dawn began to tinge the horizon, Silas increased his pace. He was now climbing steep slopes, moving with surprising agility for someone carrying a heavy pack. The trackers struggled to keep up, their lungs burning with the effort. They reached an area Pritchard vaguely recognized from the maps. They were on the slopes of Torrey Ridge, approximately 15 miles from the tavern. The terrain here was particularly rugged. Giant boulders created natural mazes. Deep ravines cut into the mountain at chaotic angles, and there were caves everywhere, dark holes that gaped in the slopes like hungry mouths. Silas disappeared into one such opening, a narrow crevice between 2 enormous rocks. The trackers stopped, signaling their position to the other teams with small mirrors that reflected the rising sunlight. Pritchard arrived half an hour later with reinforcements. There were now 15 men surrounding that cave entrance, but they all remembered what had happened the last time they tried to confront Silas in his underground territory. The discussion was brief. Morrison suggested simply blocking the entrance and waiting for Silas to be forced out by hunger or thirst. But Whitfield pointed out that there were likely multiple exits, just like in the other cave. They would need to find and guard them all simultaneously, which could take days. Pritchard had another idea. They wouldn't enter the cave, but they wouldn't leave it unguarded either. They would establish a permanent camp there, with men taking turns keeping watch around the clock. Meanwhile, they would send scouts to search for other possible entrances around the Torrey Ridge area. Eventually, Silas would have to emerge, and when he did, they would be ready. It was a siege strategy, slow but sure. The following days tested the patience of everyone involved. Camp was established about 50 meters from the cave entrance, in a position that offered good visibility, but also some protection. Groups of explorers searched the entire Torrey Ridge area, finding 6 other openings that could connect to the same cave system. Each was marked and manned by at least 2 men. Life in the camp quickly settled into a monotonous routine. 4-hour watch shifts, meals cooked over small fires to minimize smoke. Conversations were whispered, so as not to alert Silas if he were nearby. At night, the sounds of nocturnal animals and the wind in the trees created an unsettling symphony that kept the men awake long past their watch shifts. On the 3rd day, something disturbing happened. One of the men stationed at one of the secondary entrances about half a mile from the main camp disappeared. His name was Martin Keach, a local farmer who had volunteered to help with the operation. His shift partner, a man named David Lawson, had briefly left to fetch water from a nearby stream. When he returned less than 10 minutes later, Keach was simply gone. Lawson frantically searched the area, calling Keach's name in an increasingly loud voice. There were no signs of a struggle. Keach's belongings were still where he'd left them, his rifle leaning against a tree, his hat hanging from a branch, even his canteen still half full of water. It was as if he'd simply gotten up and walked into the woods, leaving everything behind. Pritchard led an immediate search with 20 men, searching in concentric circles around the spot where Keach had disappeared. They found footprints leading toward a denser area of vegetation, but the marks were confusing. There were Keach's boots, clearly identifiable by the distinctive pattern of their worn soles, but there were also other, larger, heavier footprints, running parallel to Keach's. And at one point, Keach's footprints simply stopped, as if he had been lifted off the ground. The group's morale plummeted. They weren't just hunting Silas. Somehow he had reversed the situation. Now he was the one hunting them. The fear they had felt in the village communities was now infecting the hunters themselves. Some men began talking about abandoning the operation. It wasn't worth risking any more lives. Perhaps it would be better to simply evacuate all the communities in that mountain region and let Silas have his cursed territory. But Whitfield would not stand for it. The idea of allowing a single man, no matter how dangerous, to force hundreds of families to abandon their homes and livelihoods was intolerable. He delivered an impassioned speech to the assembled group. He reminded them of the victims, of the families who never found closure, of the lives cut short on lonely mountain trails. He reminded them that they were men of the law, guardians of civilization, against the chaos that threatened to consume the region. His words resonated. The men agreed to continue, but with a change in strategy. No one would be alone or in pairs anymore. All watch posts would now have at least 5 men. The distances between posts would be reduced so they could communicate visually. And above all, no one would leave their post under any circumstances until the full shift ended, and they were officially relieved. By the evening of the 4th day, the tension was almost palpable. The men slept little, keeping longer than necessary vigils, unable to relax even when off duty. Conversation had almost completely ceased. Each man was trapped in his own dark thoughts, wondering about Martin Keach's fate, recalling Silas's disturbing words in the cave weeks before. It was Morrison who noticed first. He was at the post closest to the cave's main entrance when he noticed something strange. There was a smell in the air, something that shouldn't be there. It was smoke, but not from their fires. It was sweeter, almost candied, with a hint of something organic burning. He alerted the other men at his post, and together they began trying to identify the source of the smell. The smoke seemed to come from within the mountain itself, billowing in thin streams through cracks in the rocks surrounding the cave entrance. The smell grew stronger with each passing minute. Then they saw it. Thick smoke began to pour from the main entrance, as if someone had lit a massive bonfire deep within the cave. But there was something terribly wrong with the smoke. Its color was too dark, almost black, and the smell was now unmistakably nauseating. Pritchard came running from the main camp. He stared at the smoke for a moment, then his face paled. He recognized that smell. He'd smelled something similar years before, during a warehouse fire in Kentucky. It was the smell of burning flesh, and from the intensity of it, it wasn't just an animal. Silas was sending a message. Smoke continued to pour from the cave for over an hour, thick and black, carrying a stench that made men turn their faces and cover their noses and mouths with scarves. No one dared to enter to investigate, while the toxic cloud still filled the underground tunnels. Pritchard ordered everyone to retreat to a safe distance, keeping watch over the entrance, but avoiding unnecessary exposure to the noxious fumes. The sun was already high when the smoke finally began to clear. Whitfield decided to wait until mid-afternoon, allowing the air inside the cave to fully replenish before attempting any entry. When they finally formed a group to investigate, they numbered 6 men, all volunteers who understood the risks. They carried torches, wet scarves tied over their faces, and loaded rifles. The cave entrance was slow and cautious. Each step measured, each shadow scrutinized with extreme care. The initial tunnel was covered in black soot on the walls. The smell lingered, less intense now but still present, embedded in the rock itself. After about 30 meters of gradual descent, the tunnel opened into a small chamber. What they found there confirmed their worst fears. In the center of the chamber were the remains of a still smoldering fire, and around it, deliberately arranged, were bones. Many bones. Some clearly animal, but others of a size and shape that suggested a much more disturbing origin. Morrison, who had entered with the group, examined the remains carefully. His experience as a hunter gave him an anatomical knowledge the others lacked. After a few minutes of silent analysis, he turned to Whitfield and shook his head. He didn't need to say anything. Everyone understood. Among those bones was evidence of what had happened to at least some of Silas's victims. The revelation was both a confirmation of their darkest suspicions and a new level of horror that defied civilized comprehension. But there was more. On the walls of that chamber, written in what appeared to be charcoal or perhaps something more sinister, were words. Fragmented sentences that didn't form a coherent speech, but which revealed fragments of Silas Boone's broken mind. "The hunger never ends," read one line. "The mountains drink blood and spit bones," said another. And at what seemed to be the center of all the writing, in large, jagged letters, "I am the church and the graveyard." Pritchard ordered them to document everything carefully. They needed proof, evidence that could be presented to the authorities, that would justify the resources being spent on this operation. But most importantly, they needed to understand the extent of Silas's actions. How many victims had he committed over the years? How had he operated undetected for so long? And the most pressing question, where was he now? The chamber had 3 additional tunnels leading from it, in addition to the one they had entered through. Each led deeper into the mountain. The decision was made to explore only one of them, the widest, always maintaining a clear line of retreat. The chosen tunnel descended steeply for about 50 meters before opening into another chamber, this one much larger than the first, and what they found there left them speechless. It was as if they had discovered Silas's true lair, the place where he truly lived when he wasn't in the areas closest to the entrances. The chamber was enormous, with a high ceiling that disappeared into shadows beyond the reach of their torches. There were clear signs of prolonged occupation, organized sleeping areas piled high with stolen furs and fabrics, various utensils scattered across natural rock surfaces that served as tables, and makeshift containers for storing water drawn from underground streams they could hear running somewhere deep within. But the most impressive thing was the collection. Along an entire wall of the cave, Silas had created something that could only be described as a macabre memorial. Hundreds of personal objects were arranged on shelves built into the rock, clocks stopped at different times, as if each marked the final moment of a life, rings organized by size, photographs pinned with small chips of rock, letters folded and stacked, pieces of fabric that appeared to have been cut from clothing, and shoes, dozens of pairs of shoes, of all sizes and styles. One of the men in the group, a young man named Robert Finch, began counting quietly. He stopped when he reached 62. There were at least 62 distinct sets of personal effects, each likely representing a different victim. The scale of the horror was overwhelming. They weren't dealing with a few tragic disappearances over the course of months. They were uncovering evidence of a carnage that had stretched on for years, possibly decades. Whitfield ordered an immediate retreat. They needed more men, adequate equipment, and above all, they needed to find Silas before he could destroy more evidence or, worse yet, disappear completely into the unexplored depths of those mountains. When they emerged into the daylight, the sun was already low on the horizon, painting the sky in orange and red hues that seemed terribly appropriate given the discoveries they had just made. That night, Whitfield sent urgent messages to all relevant authorities. The governor of Virginia needed to know the magnitude of what they had discovered. Sheriffs in the neighboring states of Tennessee and North Carolina needed to be alerted, and the press, which had been kept at bay until then, now needed to be informed. Silas Boone's story could no longer be contained. The public had a right to know about the threat lurking in the shadows of Appalachia. Newspapers began publishing their first stories the following week. The Richmond Enquirer devoted its entire opening page to the case, with the dramatic headline, "Terror in the Mountains. Gruesome discoveries reveal years of atrocities." The Lynchburg Virginian published cartoons based on descriptions of the caves and the objects found. Even newspapers as far away as Charleston, South Carolina, and Knoxville, Tennessee, picked up the story. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Citizens' meetings were called in dozens of towns and cities across the Appalachian region. Petitions were circulated, demanding more aggressive action from authorities. Private rewards were offered, adding to the official reward, which now totaled $500, a massive sum at the time. Bounty hunters began arriving from distant states, drawn both by the money and the notoriety that would come from capturing the man. Newspapers were already calling the phantom of the Blue Ridge. But amid all this commotion, Silas remained elusive. Despite the constant surveillance of the caves on Torrey Ridge, despite new men arriving daily to join the hunt, despite the organized raids that systematically searched every valley and ravine, there were no new sightings. It was as if Silas had dissolved into the very mountains he knew so intimately. Pritchard had a theory. He believed Silas had realized the scale of the operation against him and completely changed his behavior pattern. Perhaps he had abandoned the region entirely, moving to more remote areas of Tennessee or Kentucky, or perhaps he was hiding in one of the thousands of smaller caves that dotted the mountains, surviving on minimal resources, patiently waiting for the pressure to ease. Time passed. August arrived, bringing stifling heat even at the highest elevations. The searches continued, but with less intensity. Some of the volunteers returned to their farms and work, normal life demanding attention. The camp at Torrey Ridge was reduced to a garrison of just 8 men. The story began to fade from the front pages of newspapers, replaced by other news: rising tensions over slavery, debates over territorial expansion, political conflicts in Richmond. But then, on August 23, 1847, something happened that would change everything again. A family traveling along the road connecting Staunton to Lexington was attacked at dusk. The father, a merchant named William Brenner, managed to defend himself with his shotgun, firing 2 shots at his attacker. The family managed to escape and reached the nearest village just after dawn, traumatized but alive. William Brenner described his attacker to local sheriffs in unmistakable detail. He was a tall, gaunt man, dressed in tattered layers of clothing, with long, matted hair and a beard. But the most significant detail was that the man was wounded. Brenner was certain that at least one of his shots had hit his target, possibly in the left shoulder or arm, based on how the attacker had staggered back into the darkness. For the first time since the hunt began, Silas Boone was vulnerable. Whitfield mobilized all available resources. If Silas was injured, he couldn't move as quickly or efficiently as before. He would need shelter, clean water, and eventually some way to treat his wound. Pritchard reorganized the search teams, focusing efforts on a 10-mile radius around the attack site. Sniffer dogs were brought in from neighboring farms, animals trained to track deer and bear, that could now be used to track a wounded man. The dogs picked up a scent almost immediately. There were bloodstains on the ground along the trail where the attack had occurred, and the animals followed the scent with determination, pulling their handlers up the mountain. The trail led southeast, away from the areas where Silas had been seen previously. After about 5 miles, the dogs stopped in an area of large rocks, barking furiously at a narrow crevice between 2 rock formations. The opening was too small for a man to easily fit through, but there were fresh bloodstains on the rock's edges. Pritchard examined the area carefully. The bloodstains were abundant here, suggesting Silas had either stopped to try to staunch the wound or had simply lost more blood from the exertion of climbing this far. It was a good sign. A man losing blood couldn't go very far without eventually collapsing. They decided not to attempt entry through the crevice immediately. Instead, they positioned men around the entire rocky area, searching for other possible exits. They found 2, a larger opening about 20 meters above, accessible only by a difficult climb, and another opening partially hidden by vegetation at the base of the rocks. All 3 were surrounded and guarded. This time, there would be no mistake. Silas was trapped. Morrison suggested a different approach. Rather than go in and risk another confrontation under conditions that would be advantageous to Silas, why not just wait? A wounded man without supplies would have to leave eventually. They could maintain the siege for days, even weeks if necessary. Thirst and the wound's infection would do the work for them. It was a cold-blooded strategy, but effective. And after months of frustration, the idea of finally having Silas in a position of weakness was too tempting to ignore. The decision was made. They established a permanent camp around the rocks, with rotating watchguards. 3 fires were kept burning continuously, forming a triangle around the perimeter. At night, the light from the flames eliminated the shadows where Silas might try to escape unnoticed. During the day, men with binoculars observed every inch of the rock formations, looking for any sign of movement. The first 2 days passed uneventfully. There were no sounds from the rocks, no visible movement, no sign that Silas was still there. Some men began to wonder if he had somehow escaped before the siege was fully established, but Pritchard remained confident. The dogs had tracked the scent to those rocks and found no trace of an exit. Silas was there. He had to be. On the morning of the third day, something changed. One of the lookouts noticed a faint but distinctive odor coming from the direction of the rocks. It was the smell of infection, of wounded flesh beginning to rot. Pritchard recognized the odor immediately. He had seen gunshot wounds turn gangrenous before, especially when left untreated. If Silas didn't receive medical attention soon, the infection would kill him. Perhaps he was already in its final stages, delirious with fever deep within that small, rocky refuge. Whitfield called a meeting to decide the next step. There were arguments on both sides. Some thought they should continue waiting, letting nature take its course. Others argued that they had a responsibility to try to capture Silas alive, so he could face a proper trial, so the victims' families could have some form of justice and closure. And there was also the practical issue. Silas was the only person who knew the true extent of his crimes, where all the victims were, and whether there were accomplices who had never been identified. The final decision was to attempt a forced extraction. They would prepare a group of 6 men, well armed and equipped with ropes and torches. They would enter through the larger opening, which offered more room to maneuver, and attempt to locate Silas within the cave system. If he resisted violently, they would be authorized to use lethal force. But if there was any chance of capturing him alive, that would be the priority. The group was carefully selected. Pritchard would lead, accompanied by Morrison, Whitfield, and 3 other men chosen for their experience and proven courage. They prepared meticulously, checking weapons, distributing extra torches, and tying ropes to each other so no one would get lost in the potential ramifications of the cave system. A doctor was brought from camp, a man named Albert Hastings, who agreed to accompany the group if they managed to bring Silas back alive. The entry began at noon, when the sunlight was at its highest, offering some natural light through the openings. The climb to the upper entrance was difficult, but manageable. Once inside, they found themselves in a jagged tunnel that descended at a moderate angle. The walls were rough, with sharp protrusions that would tear clothing and skin if not avoided. The ceiling was low in places, forcing them to crawl. After about 50 feet of slow progress, the tunnel opened into a small chamber, no larger than a modest bedroom, and there, huddled in a corner, illuminated by the flickering light of their torches, was Silas Boone. But the man they saw bore little resemblance to the fearsome predator that had terrorized the mountains for years. He was pale to the point of almost translucent, his eyes sunken and glassy. His left arm was wrapped in bloody, filthy rags, the surrounding fabric stained with yellowish and green pus. Silas didn't try to attack or flee. He simply stared at the men with an expression that mixed confusion and something that might have been relief. His mouth moved, trying to form words, but only hoarse, incoherent sounds came out. Pritchard approached cautiously, keeping his rifle level, but with his finger off the trigger. Up close, it was clear that Silas was in critical condition. The fever was raging, and the wound in his arm was far worse than expected. The bullet had torn through the muscle, and without proper treatment, the infection had spread rapidly. Morrison and another man tied Silas with ropes, ensuring that even in a final burst of energy, he would pose no threat. Dr. Hastings examined the wound briefly and shook his head gravely. The infection was advanced. Even with immediate treatment, the chances of survival were slim. But there was a chance, and that was more than enough. They needed to get him out of there and to a village where he could receive proper medical care. The extraction was a slow and painful process. Silas could barely walk, having to be practically carried through the narrow tunnel. He fainted several times, forcing them to stop and check if he was still alive. When they finally emerged into the daylight, a crowd had gathered at the camp. Word had spread quickly that Silas Boone had been captured, and men from nearby villages had come to witness the moment. What they saw disappointed them. It wasn't the diabolical monster they had imagined, but a broken man, more dead than alive, raving with fever as he was strapped to a makeshift stretcher. Some in the crowd shouted for immediate justice, suggesting they hang him right there from a nearby tree. But Whitfield intervened, his rifle raised to maintain order. "This man will answer for his crimes before a court of law," he declared firmly. "We are not barbarians. We are men of the law." The journey back to Lexington took 2 full days. Silas was carried on a stretcher, occasionally regaining consciousness, mumbling incoherent words about mountains, hunger, and eternal shadows. Dr. Hastings did his best to keep him stable, changing his infected bandages, forcing water between his cracked lips, applying cold compresses when his fever rose dangerously high. But everyone knew Silas's chances of surviving long enough to face trial were slim. When they arrived in Lexington on the afternoon of August 27, 1847, a crowd of over 200 people waited in the streets. The news had spread like wildfire. Merchants closed their shops. Farmers abandoned their fields. Everyone wanted to see the man who had become a dark legend, the ghost who had haunted the mountains and taken so many lives. When they saw Silas being carried away on a stretcher, unconscious and clearly near death, there was a heavy silence followed by disappointed murmurs. Silas was taken to a makeshift cell in the basement of City Hall, the safest place available in Lexington. The doctor set up a treatment station there, working tirelessly to stabilize his patient. Amputation of his left arm was considered, but Hastings feared Silas wouldn't survive the surgery in his weakened state. Instead, he cleaned the wound as best he could, applied poultices of medicinal herbs, and prayed that the robust constitution that had kept Silas alive in the mountains for so long would hold him a little longer. For 3 days, Silas hovered between life and death. There were moments when he seemed to be improving, when his fever would break and he could swallow broth, but then the infection would gain ground again, and he would sink into deep deliriums where he would scream about things only he could see. In his most lucid moments, Whitfield tried to interrogate him, seeking confessions, names of victims, locations of bodies. But Silas rarely responded coherently, and when he did, his words were enigmatic and disturbing. "They never left," he murmured once, his eyes fixed on the low ceiling of the cell. "They are all still there deep down, where the earth embraces them. I was only the conduit. The mountains have always been hungry, always have been." Another time he looked directly at Whitfield and said, "You think you captured me, but it is the mountains that released me. They are finished with me. I was only an instrument, and now the instrument is broken." On the morning of August 31st, Silas Boone died. It wasn't a dramatic event. He simply stopped breathing in his sleep, his fever finally sapping the last of his ravaged body's lifeblood. Dr. Hastings recorded the official time of death as 5:42 in the morning. The cause was a blood infection resulting from a gunshot wound. He was 33 years old, though he appeared to be at least 50 when captured. The news of Silas's death provoked mixed reactions. Many felt relief that the threat had been eliminated. Others expressed frustration that he would never face formal trial, never publicly answer for his crimes, never give the victims' families the closure they deserved. Newspapers published lengthy obituaries, detailing not his life, but his alleged crimes, listing the names of missing people believed to be connected to him. Silas's body was buried in an unmarked grave on the outer edge of Lexington Cemetery, far from the respectable graves of the town's citizens. There was no ceremony, no prayers said. Only 4 men were present: Whitfield, Pritchard, Morrison, and the gravedigger. They wanted the burial to be discreet, fearing that morbid curiosity seekers or souvenir hunters would attempt to desecrate the grave. The exact location was never officially recorded, and over time even those present forgot or refused to remember exactly where they had placed the remains of the man who had terrorized the mountains. But Silas's death didn't spell the end of the story. In the weeks and months that followed, teams organized by Whitfield and Pritchard systematically searched every cave identified as a possible hiding place for Silas. The work was arduous, dangerous, and emotionally devastating. In several caves they found human remains, human bones in various stages of decomposition, some clearly from recent victims, others so ancient they crumbled to the touch. The identification work was extremely difficult. Without modern forensic techniques, they relied on personal objects found near the remains to try to establish identities. Watches engraved with initials or names, wedding rings with inscriptions, fragments of letters that survived the humid conditions of the caves. Over 6 months of searching, they managed to positively identify 19 victims and find remains of at least 37 other individuals who could never be named. Families who received confirmation about their loved one's fate had mixed reactions. Some expressed gratitude for finally knowing the truth, for being able to bury their dead properly. Others were consumed by renewed anger, furious that Silas had escaped justice through death. And there were those who simply gave in to their grief, a grief that had been kept in abeyance for years, finally allowed to flow freely. The impact of Silas Boone's story extended far beyond the immediate communities affected. It became a cautionary tale, told in taverns and around campfires throughout the Appalachian region. Parents used the story to teach their children about the dangers of the mountains. Preachers incorporated it into sermons on the evil that can grow in hearts isolated from society and divine grace. Tabloid writers transformed it into increasingly exaggerated narratives, adding fictional details that eventually obscured the real facts. But perhaps the most lasting legacy was the shift in how mountain communities approached safety and community vigilance. Early warning systems were established, with taverns and trading posts keeping records of travelers and reporting suspicious individuals to local authorities. Main trade routes were improved and patrolled more regularly. And above all, a culture developed of never traveling alone in the most remote parts of the mountains, a custom that would persist for generations. Pritchard remained in the region for another year after Silas's death, assisting in the final search and training local trackers. When he finally departed for Kentucky, he left detailed instructions on how to identify suspicious behavior patterns and organize efficient search operations. He never spoke publicly about his experience hunting Silas Boone, but those who knew him noticed that something had changed in him. There was a shadow in his eyes that had not been there before, a weight he would carry for the rest of his life. Whitfield remained sheriff of Rockbridge County for another 17 years. He became a respected figure, known for his unwavering dedication to justice and order. But on quiet nights, when he was alone in his office, he would occasionally pull from a locked drawer a small journal where he had recorded every detail of the Silas Boone case. He read the entries, recalling every discovery, every moment of terror and triumph, and he wondered about Silas's final words, about mountains that hungered, about broken instruments and dark purposes that were never fully understood. Morrison returned to his life as a hunter, but never again ventured as deep into the mountains as he had before. He helped train a generation of young trackers, always emphasizing respect for the mountains and awareness of the dangers that might lurk in remote places. When asked about Silas Boone, he usually deflected the conversation. But once, years later, on a particularly cold winter night, he told a group of young men around a campfire, "The mountains hold secrets. Some of those secrets have names and stories. Others are older, deeper. Silas Boone was just one of them. But make no mistake, these mountains still hunger." Years passed, but the Appalachian Mountains continued to hold their stories in the deep shadows of their valleys and the silent chambers of their countless caves. The story of Silas Boone gradually transformed from living memory to legend, from documented fact to whispered myth. The generations who lived through the events died one by one, taking with them details that were never recorded, nuances of terror that no written word could fully capture. But something remained, a feeling anyone who hikes alone in the most remote parts of the Blue Ridge Mountains can still feel. It's that moment when the wind stops blowing and the birds stop singing, when the shadows seem thicker than they should be in the light filtering through the treetops. When you have the absolute irrational and visceral certainty that you're being watched by something that understands this territory in a way you never could. Decades after Silas's death, explorers occasionally found caves no one knew existed. In some of them, there were unmistakable signs of ancient human occupation, marks on the walls, ashes from long-extinct fires, and occasionally objects that hinted at stories they'd rather not imagine. The explorers reported their discoveries, and then the caves were sealed or simply forgotten again, swallowed by the green vastness of the mountains that rose above them as if to hide ancient scars. Official records about Silas Boone are surprisingly sparse for someone who caused so much terror. Part of this was intentional. Virginia authorities, embarrassed that such an atrocity could occur under their jurisdiction for so long without detection, downplayed the extent of the crimes in public documents. Part of this was simply the result of the passage of time and the fragmentary nature of records in the period leading up to the American Civil War, which would begin just 14 years after Silas's death and consume the attention and resources of the entire nation. But in dusty county archives across Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina, fragments still exist. Sheriffs' reports of unexplained disappearances, letters from desperate families searching for lost loved ones, expense records for search operations, and occasionally, in the shaky handwriting of clerks clearly distraught by what they needed to document, brief descriptions of cave finds that defy civilized imagination. There are also the memorials. In small cemeteries scattered throughout the mountains, there are headstones with death dates listed as early as 1847, many marked simply as missing, presumed dead in the mountains. Some have full names and elaborate inscriptions. Others are just simple stones with time-worn initials. They are silent monuments to lives cut short, to journeys that ended in dark places that should never have become graves. What Silas Boone really was remains a matter of speculation and debate among those few who still study the case. Was he simply a man driven mad by the brutal isolation and starvation of a mountain winter? Or was there something deeper, some pre-existing darkness in his soul that circumstances merely unleashed? The evidence can be interpreted in multiple ways, and the truth likely died with him that August morning when his body finally gave in to the infection. What we know for sure is that he represents something universal and terrifying. He's a reminder that civilization is a thin veneer over savagery, that under enough pressure or in deep enough isolation, that veneer can crack. He shows us that monsters don't have to have horns and claws. Sometimes they have human faces, human stories, and it's precisely this lost humanity that makes them so disturbing. The caves where Silas lived, and where so many met their ends, remain in the mountains. Some have been mapped and occasionally visited by modern cavers equipped with technology Whitfield and Pritchard could never have imagined. But many others have never been rediscovered. They remain there, dark chambers beneath tons of rock, holding secrets perhaps best left buried. Mountains have always been good at keeping secrets. Today, if you drive the modern roads that cut through the Blue Ridge Mountains, you'll pass breathtakingly beautiful landscapes. Verdant valleys, mist-shrouded peaks, ancient forests that seem untouched by time. Tourists stop at scenic overlooks to take photographs. Hikers explore well-marked trails. Families picnic in state parks. It's hard to imagine, looking at all this serene beauty, that these same mountains were once the scene of horrors that defy comprehension. But the older locals still know. They know the stories passed down through generations. They know which areas of the mountains to avoid, which caves never to explore, which ancient trails not to follow when darkness begins to fall. And occasionally, on nights when the moon is hidden behind heavy clouds and the wind howls through the canyons like ghostly voices, they remember Silas Boone, the hunter who became the hunted, the man the mountains turned into something monstrous and whom the mountains finally claimed for their own. Silas Boone's story is too bad for the official history books. It's too uncomfortable, too dark. It raises too many questions about human nature that we'd rather not confront. So it exists in the margins, in obscure county records, in whispered stories, in local legends that tourists dismiss as exaggerated folklore. But for those who know the truth, for those who have studied the documents and hiked the mountains where it all happened, the story is real, terribly, undeniably real. And perhaps it's appropriate that it should be this way. Perhaps some stories shouldn't be polished and presented as palatable entertainment. Perhaps they should remain harsh, disturbing, difficult to digest. Because it is these stories that teach us the most important lessons about the limits of humanity, about what we can become when those limits are crossed, and about the importance of never, ever allowing such things to happen again. The Appalachian Mountains remain. Ancient, indifferent, eternal. They saw Silas Boone born, saw his atrocities, saw his capture and death, and they will continue long after we are all gone, holding their secrets deep in their caves, in the shadows of their valleys, in the stories whispered around campfires on cold winter nights. If this story touched you, if it made you reflect on the dark mysteries that still lurk in the world's forgotten places, help this channel continue to bring you stories like this. Subscribe so you don't miss the next disturbing accounts we unearth from the dusty archives of history. Leave a like if you enjoy this kind of investigative and in-depth content, and in the comments tell us, do you know of any dark stories from your own region? Any local mysteries that have never been fully explained? We'd love to hear them. Until the next journey through the shadows of history.